I know. I can't stay away.
I was running from my ex, and that night I begged the Mafia boss to pretend to love me in front of the man who swore he still owned me. Gavin expected me to lower my head, hide my bruised wrist, and accept one more humiliation. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I just chose the most dangerous table in the restaurant and made the request no sensible woman would ever make. Ronan Vale didn't know me, but he stood up, touched my waist, and called me mine. The lie was supposed to last a minute. Only men like him don't fake love without turning it into a debt. Hi, I'm Lena. A special shout out to those of you watching Book 1 for free here on the My Stories platform, completely ad-free and uninterrupted. Chapter 1, The Dark Corner Table. The last cup of the night slipped from my towel and almost flew against the counter. I caught it mid-air, startled, and the handle slammed into my left wrist right where the sleeve didn't quite cover. I sucked in air through my mouth, silently, and set the dish back in the sink as if nothing had happened. Mrs. Doyle, who had owned that North End coffee shop for as long as I could remember, glanced up over her crooked glasses and pretended not to see. Pretending was one of the oldest kindnesses of that place. Finish up, Celine. Her voice was thick, rough from all those cigarettes she swore she'd never smoke again. Mary from the restaurant called 3 times. The waitress on the reserved table got sick. They'll pay double for the extra shift if you go now. I did the math before she even finished the sentence. Double a shift was almost a week of my mother's medication. I took off the apron without answering, feeling the rough fabric scrape against the tired skin of my neck. Be careful, she added, without looking at me. That corner table is only for dangerous men. Don't stare, don't ask, don't spill water. I never spill water. You spill it when you're scared. She wiped the counter harder than she needed to, and the smell of cheap detergent rose between us. Watch out for fear, girl. Bree came through the back door with the empty tray balanced on her fingertips, her short red hair held up by a pencil. Bridget Callahan shared with me shifts, cold sandwiches, and almost every secret. Almost. You're really covering for Mary? She asked, stopping beside me. You've been on your feet for 12 hours already, Sel. It's 4 more. I'll sleep tomorrow. You've been saying that since I met you, and you've never slept tomorrow. I gave a weak smile, grabbed the thin coat off the hook behind the door, and slung the bag strap over my shoulder. Bree caught my wrist gently, without squeezing, and still, my whole skin remembered. She saw the bruise. She didn't say anything. She pressed her lips together. Call if he shows up, she whispered. He doesn't show up in a dangerous man's restaurant. He shows up anywhere that hurts you. That's his way. I left before she could go on. Thursday night in the North End smelled like burnt garlic, light rain, and smoke from the low chimneys. I walked 3 blocks along the narrow sidewalk, dodging puddles, counting steps so I wouldn't think. 25 years old, 1 small room, 2 shifts, a mother in a clinic that smelled like cheap disinfectant. It was the life I had, and still it was mine. I repeated that like a prayer. The restaurant sat behind a discreet facade. No sign. The people who needed to come in knew where it was. Mary was waiting for me at the back door, her hairnet already off and her face pale with fever, hands crossed over her crumpled apron. The dining room's full. Table 7 is just sparkling water. Table 9 is the whole menu. She handed me the little notepad with trembling hands. And the corner table, by the dark window, doesn't ask anything. You just bring whatever they order and disappear. Who is it? You don't want to know. I cut across the narrow kitchen, fixed my hair in the reflection of the stainless steel fridge, and stepped into the dining room with my head down. The restaurant had yellow lighting, walls lined in dark wood, and the kind of silence that only exists when everyone is respecting something at the same time. I understood where I was before I even looked up. The corner table was pushed against the wall opposite the entrance, set apart from the others by a stretch of respect that no one dared to fill. 2 men took the side chairs, broad shoulders under dark suits, hands visible on the tablecloth. In the center, sitting with his back to the wall and facing the entire room, was the third. I didn't need a name to know who ran things there. He had the kind of stillness that only comes from someone who has never had to move to be obeyed. Dark hair combed back, graphite gray tie, a matte gold ring on his finger, with a knot design I couldn't place. His eyes lifted when I walked past and dropped again, unhurried, with no apparent curiosity. I kept going. Took the order at table 9, brought it back to the kitchen, returned, took care of table 7, returned. The room breathed. I breathed. That's when the front door swung open and Gavin Rowe walked in. I knew by the scent before I even turned. Citrus wood, expensive alcohol, a cologne he'd worn since college, one I'd spent years trying to wash out of my pillows. He came in laughing at his own remark, a blonde woman on his arm, dressed like a judge off the bench. The maitre d' recognized his name and led him to a table diagonal to my rote. Right on my rote. I looked at Mary from the corner of the kitchen. Mary looked back at me like she wished she could disappear in my place. There was no other waitress to switch with me. I breathed through my nose, 3 counts, and went to bring the sparkling water to table 7. Siren. His voice came out soft, in exactly the tone he used in public, exactly the tone he used before he squeezed. Look at this. The siren turned into an official waitress. The blonde laughed, not understanding, thinking it was an inside joke. I set the bottle down on table 7 without answering, my hand so steady it hurt. I kept walking. You're not going to say hello to an old client, he insisted, loud enough for half the room to hear. Here, sweetheart, come over. I want to introduce you to Annalise. Annalise, this is Celine. We almost got married. Almost. Because she thought she deserved more. He laughed, and the laugh scraped through the air between the tables. Poor thing. Still hunting for the guy who can pretend a woman like her is worth anything. The blonde laughed again, awkwardly, this time uncomfortable. 2 customers at nearby tables looked at the floor. The bartender stopped polishing his glass mid-motion. I felt the blood rise to the roots of my hair and drop all at once down to my feet. Cold, cold, cold. I could run to the kitchen. I could cry in the bathroom. I could lose the extra shift. I could lose the double pay. I could go home without the money for my mother's medicine. I could. Each possibility tightened my chest 1 notch more, and none of them came close to giving back what he had just torn out of me in front of strangers. That was the moment my eyes met the man's at the corner table. He wasn't looking at me with pity. He wasn't looking at me with curiosity. He was watching Gavin the way a hunter watches a small animal that's wandered into the wrong territory. Then his gaze dropped to my wrist. Not my face. My wrist. To the purple mark my sleeve didn't quite cover. I didn't decide with my head. I decided with the rest of me. I crossed the room with the open notepad in my hand, stopped beside the corner table, leaned over as if I were taking an order, and bent down just enough that my voice came out for him alone. From that close I caught his scent, something like dark wood, cold smoke, and expensive leather. Nothing sweet. Act like you love me, please. I said it once. I didn't repeat it. I didn't add a name, didn't add an apology, didn't add an explanation. I stood there with the pencil hovering over the paper, my breath locked deep in my chest, waiting for him to laugh, to wave me away, to ignore me, to order wine. The silence lasted a second, maybe 2. I counted my pulse at my own throat, against the tight collar of my uniform. He stood up. There was no hurry in the gesture. It was as if the whole table had been invited to pause. The 2 men at his sides didn't move, and yet something in them went on alert, shoulders a fraction higher. He pushed back his chair, took a step toward me, and his hand came around behind me, settled on my waist over the uniform, and rested there with the calm of someone slipping a key into his own lock. It wasn't a stranger's touch. It was an owner's touch. I had never been touched that way before. Touched like that without hurry, without proof, without violence. It was so strange that I forgot to breathe. "I'm sorry I'm late," he said, voice low, exactly loud enough to reach Gavin's table. "I asked you to wait out front and you waited. I should have come for you sooner." His eyes dropped to mine, and the first thing I saw was a very dark blue, the color of the sea when no one is looking. He didn't ask permission. He simply went on, raising the volume just a little now, only as much as was needed. "Gentlemen," his head tilted toward Gavin with the politeness of a blade. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't interrupt her evening any further." Pause. "She's mine." The word dropped into the room like a crystal glass on a marble floor. It didn't break. It cut. I saw Gavin's face lose color beneath the fake tan. I saw the blonde fix her gaze on the ring on the hand at my waist, and freeze for a second, like someone recognizing a symbol she should have seen in some society column. I saw the maitre d' swallow. I saw the bartender go back to polishing his glass faster. I saw Gavin open his mouth to respond and close it again, 3 times, like a fish yanked out of water. "Good evening," Gavin finally said, his voice thin. He grabbed his coat from the chair, took the blonde by the arm, and walked out without finishing his order. The bell over the door rang once, sharp, and it was the sweetest sound I'd heard in years. The hand on my waist didn't move until the door slammed. Only then did he lean down a little, his warm breath passing close to my ear, the faint scent of aged whiskey on it, and say, softly, just for me, finish your shift, leave through the back door. I nodded, yes, not trusting my voice. His hand slid and dropped, slowly, never squeezing, and for an instant the absence of the touch weighed more than the touch itself. He sat back down. The two men at his sides hadn't moved the entire time. I crossed the dining room on legs that weren't mine. I served table 9. I served table 7. I didn't spill water. Mary, from the kitchen, looked at me as if she'd just watched a miracle happen in slow motion in the middle of service. I couldn't smile. I couldn't cry. I made it to the end of the shift like someone walking on thin glass with bare feet. When the last customer left, I took my pay from Mary's hand, traded the apron for my thin jacket, and pushed open the back door. The alley was narrow, barely lit by a yellow bulb that flickered above a pantry door. It smelled like wet garbage and rain, with a metallic undertone of old rusted iron. I put my hand on the wall to breathe, and the damp brick chilled my palm. A dark car was parked right at the mouth of the alley, engine off. Leaning against the side, hands shoved into the pockets of an overcoat and his face neutral, a tall man was waiting. Short hair and the shoulders of someone who had carried heavy things before. He didn't come closer. He just held out his arm with a white envelope between his fingers. Miss Ward. His voice was dry, with a drawled accent. No ceremony at all. Declan Murphy. The boss is asking you to come see him tomorrow. Same restaurant. Noon. I looked at the envelope without taking it. And if I don't go? He considered the question as if it were a reasonable equation, his head tilting a fraction. You'll go. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. But the boss preferred to ask. I held out my hand. The envelope was heavier than it should have been. I pressed the paper between my fingers, stared at the empty alley in front of me, and understood, with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with the temperature of the night, that I had just traded a cage for a door, and that I still didn't know whether the door had a lock on my side. Chapter 2: The Deal. The phone rang for the 6th time before I could get my eyes open. The morning light came through the only window in my small room, gray and slanted, cutting across the curtain torn at the hem and drawing a pale stripe on the worn wood floor. I stretched my arm to the nightstand, knocked over the alarm clock, found the phone under the pillow, and answered with a scraped voice. Are you alive, or do I need to come over there with a screwdriver? Bree. Celine Ward. Get out of that bed right now and open the City News app. I want to hear you scream at me. Live. I sat on the edge of the mattress, the blanket tangled around my feet, and opened the app with my other hand. The room smelled like laundry washed with cheap soap and the coffee from the floor below, which rose through the crack in the door like a promise that never fully delivered. Bree was panting on the other end, thrilled, scandalized, and somewhere in between. It was the first photo on the social column, me, in uniform, with the notepad in my hand, slightly leaning, his hand on my waist. The angle was cruel. Someone must have clicked it from a neighboring table, or from the street, through the window. The caption asked who the mysterious companion of the Vale heir was. His name appeared in bold, underlined by another word I had never before associated with anyone made of flesh and bone. Boss. Ronan Vale, Bree pronounced in my ear, slowly, savoring every syllable. Ronan Vale, 34 years old, heir, orphaned by a Mafia father at 15. Siren, your random pick of a man in a restaurant was a Mafia boss. You won the game. You won every game. I didn't pick, I asked. You asked Mr. Apocalypse in a suit to pretend he loved you. She took a deep breath. I swear, I think I'm proud. I closed my eyes. The smell of cheap coffee from the floor below rose through the crack in the door. My head ached. My wrist ached more. When I turned my hand into the light, the mark was darker than the night before, a purplish ring that looked like the imprint of another skin. Come to the coffee shop, Bree pleaded. Mrs. Doyle is already blaspheming against life in general, and against you in particular, but she bought fresh bread. Come. I hung up, stared at the phone a second longer than I should have. A new message blinked from a number saved as a single letter. Gee, this doesn't end like this, Siren. I deleted it. I didn't reply. I deleted it again. From the history, from the trash, from memory, from anything I could reach. I threw on the first blouse I grabbed from the closet, slipped on my sneakers, washed my face with cold water, and went downstairs. The freezing water stung my jaw and brought me back into my body. The neighborhood was waking up in Italian, in Irish, in car horns. I crossed over to the coffee shop with my hood up. avoiding shop windows. Mrs. Doyle was behind the counter, with the paper open to the society column page, pretending she hadn't seen my photo. She only wipes with that kind of force when she's pretending something. Coffee, she grumbled. Sitting down, before you fall. Good morning to you too. The day decides if it's good after you explain to me what this here means. She pointed at the photo with the handle of the cloth. I warned you, girl. Don't stare. Don't ask. Don't spill water. I didn't say a thing about marrying a man. I didn't get married. Whoever sees this photo doesn't think the same. Bree came out of the kitchen with a tray, stopped, set the tray on the counter, and hugged me from the side, in silence. That hug undid me more than the photo. I sat down. You okay? She asked, quietly. I don't know. It's okay not to know. She squeezed my shoulder. Did you eat? No. So eat. And then decide the rest of your life. I was chewing without tasting anything when the dark car pulled up in front of the window. The same one from the alley. Declan got out of the driver's side, unhurried, closed the door, adjusted his overcoat, and walked into the coffee shop like he was walking into his own kitchen. Mrs. Doyle stopped wiping. Bree's mouth opened slowly. Ms. Ward. He tilted his head a centimeter. Noon. It's 40 minutes away. Traffic. Mrs. Doyle looked at me with the face of a grandmother crossed with a witch. Take your bag, child. And if he treats you badly, I'm going over there. Bree grabbed the tablet she kept under the counter for orders and held it up in front of me, still open to the photo. Tell Mr. Apocalypse in a suit that if he ruins my friend, I'm throwing hot coffee on him. And I like this coffee. Declan considered Bree for a second longer than was necessary. He didn't answer. He opened the door for me. The car was armored. I could tell by the weight of the door before I noticed the glass. I sat in the back seat, hugged the bag against my chest, and watched North End traffic pass by like it was the first time. The leather of the seat smelled like something expensive and clean, without being perfumed. Declan drove with both hands on the wheel, in silence. At some point, without turning his head, he spoke. There's coffee in the cup holder. Still hot. Pause. The boss asked me not to let you arrive, shaking. I looked at the paper cup, looked at the back of his neck, took the coffee. The warmth passed through the cardboard and reached my fingers before the taste reached my mouth. I didn't say thank you. He didn't expect me to. The restaurant at that hour was a different place. Empty, with chairs still flipped on some tables, the smell of bread fresh out of the oven and a faint trace of furniture polish. The maitre d' didn't recognize me as the waitress from the night before, or pretended very well, and led me through a side hallway to a dark wood door. He pushed it open. The enclosed terrace opened up in front of me, covered in glass, heated, with a single round table set for two. Ronan Vale was standing, his back to me, looking at the inner garden through the glass. He wore black. The matte gold ring on his finger caught the faint light. He turned when he heard my steps. The very dark blue eyes traveled down my face, my neck, my wrist, always the wrist. He pulled out the chair for me without a word. I sat down. Coffee? He asked. I already had 2. One more won't hurt. Depends who's offering. A near smile crossed the corner of his mouth. It didn't quite become anything. He poured anyway, 2 fingers, into the fine porcelain cup. The dark stream fell soundlessly, and the scent rose, cleaner, more bitter than the one at the coffee shop. He sat down across from me. Celine Ward, he said, and the way he pronounced my full name left me strange. 25 years old. Waitress at Doyle's coffee shop. Mother in the public clinic on Albany Street. Father absent since childhood. No criminal record. Rent 2 months overdue. About to be paid off with double last night's shift. Engagement broken off a year ago with Gavin Rowe. No formal complaint, but the hospital has 3 records of treatment. I set the cup down before I dropped it. The porcelain touched the saucer with a thin chime, and I noticed my hand was shaking a little less than I expected. You investigated me. I've been investigating Gavin Rowe for months. You showed up in the reports before you showed up in my dining room. Why? Because he launders money for people I don't care for. He held my eyes without looking away. I didn't know he'd put his hands on you until I saw your wrist. The terrace went very quiet for a moment. The glass was fogged at the edges by the heater. I noticed a green leaf stuck on the outside, sliding slowly down the surface, held in place by a drop of water that insisted on not falling. Why am I here? I asked. Because the photo ran today. Because he isn't going to stop. He folded his hands on the table. Long fingers. Calm. I can offer a deal. For a few weeks. You stay under my protection. You appear with me at 2 or 3 events. You greet the right people. In exchange, I guarantee your safety and pay for your mother's treatment in a decent clinic. You're buying my presence. I'm buying time. Pause. The difference matters. I looked at the garden behind him. I thought about my mother, about the nurse who held her arm too tightly when she bathed her, about the smell of cheap disinfectant that stuck to my hair for hours after every visit. I thought about Gavin writing, "This doesn't end like this," siren, on the screen of the phone. I thought about his hand on my wrist, his voice in the dining room, the word laughing. I wasn't going to say yes because it was safe. I was going to say yes because I had nowhere left to run and he knew it. I hated him a little for knowing. 3 conditions, I said. He tilted his head, attentive. No violence in my name. You don't hurt anyone because I exist. If Gavin has to fall, he falls inside the law. Agreed. I keep working at the coffee shop. I don't get locked up in any house. Mrs. Doyle needs me at the counter. Agreed. Very short pause. With Declan on the corner? Negotiable. No. I pressed my lips together. He waited, unhurried, and it was his calm that made me swallow the argument I already had ready. Third, you never decide anything about my mother without consulting me. Doctor, treatment, transfer, nothing. She's my responsibility. He looked at me for a second longer than necessary. I couldn't read what passed across his face, but something behind those dark eyes settled in a different way. When he answered, his voice had dropped half a tone. Agreed. He extended his hand across the table. I looked at his hand for a moment before I touched it. Warm skin, dry palm, the matte gold ring brushing my finger as ours crossed. The touch was firmer than delicate, and still careful in the exact measure that he avoided my bruised wrist. It wasn't a long grip. It was enough. Your things will be picked up this afternoon, he said. Declan will take you to the coffee shop first to finish your shift. You sleep at the mansion tonight. I sleep in my own room tonight. I'll come tomorrow, with my bag packed. He considered. He agreed with a minimal nod. Tomorrow. I stood up. He stood up too, unhurried. When I passed through the door, his voice came at my back, calm, unraised. Celine. I turned. Last night, in the dining room, you could have asked for anything. He looked at me directly. I wanted to know why you asked me to act. I gripped the doorknob. The metal was cold on my palm, and for an instant it was the only real thing in the hallway. I thought of 3 answers. I spoke the only true one. Because asking someone to actually love me, I wouldn't know how to do that anymore. He didn't answer. I closed the door. Declan drove me back to the coffee shop without commenting on anything. Mrs. Doyle handed me the apron without commenting on anything. Bree handed me the notepad, without commenting on anything. I worked 4 hours on autopilot, counted the register, took my share, and walked home because I needed to feel my own steps on the ground again. The cold cut through the collar of my coat, and I was grateful for it. Anything that reminded me I was still whole. I climbed the stairs of the old building with the key already in my hand. The railing creaked under the weight, as always, and the second-floor light flickered at its same irregular frequency. When I turned at my landing, I stopped. The door to my apartment was ajar. The lock, intact. I hadn't forgotten it open. I never forget it open. I pushed it with my fingertips. The dresser drawers were pulled out. The mattress had been flipped. The photo of my mother, on the table, had its glass cracked diagonally. A strange smell hung in the air. It wasn't from my soap. It wasn't from my perfume. It was from someone who had been there long enough to leave a signature. On the bathroom mirror, written in red lipstick, my lipstick, the only one I had, a single line crossed the reflection. This doesn't end like this, siren. The bag fell off my shoulder on its own. I didn't even notice when the phone started vibrating against my leg. Chapter 3. Under the Same Roof. After the break-in, I called Declan before I could even breathe properly. In less than an hour, he had me out of that apartment with the clothes on my back and a bag packed in a rush. Now the small bag sat open on the bed of the room I had chosen in the Vale mansion, and I stared at its contents as if they belonged to another woman. 3 blouses, 2 pairs of pants, a beat-up notebook I had carried with me since I was 17, the photograph of my mother before the illness, and the thin coat that no longer warmed anyone. That was all. 25 years fit there, and still, on that Saturday morning, it seemed like a lot. The light coming through the tall windows fell at an angle across the wine-colored rug, and there was a discreet scent of furniture polish in the air, the kind that only exists in houses where someone cleans before the sun wakes up. You sure about this room? Ronan was leaning against the doorframe, not stepping inside. It was a silent gesture I was starting to recognize. The kind of courtesy he dispensed the way someone offers the door before the word. The east wing has more light. This one's smaller, I answered, folding a blouse that didn't need folding. I prefer the smaller one. About last night. His voice dropped half a tone. The apartment, the lipstick on the mirror. I already had the locks changed. You had them changed without asking me. I did. I saw the line on the mirror. Ronan. I saw my mother's photo cracked. And you decided alone what to do with my door. He nodded with that minimal motion that brushed off any argument. But this time the nod cost him something. He didn't argue about curtains, about the view, about the size of the bathroom. He only watched my wrist for half a second, noted something he would never say aloud, and went downstairs to whatever the life of a man like him was at 9 a.m. I heard his steps move away on the floorboards, calculated, heavy without being loud, and realized I had been holding my breath until the sound faded. The mansion had too many hallways. I figured that out on the second day, when I got lost trying to find the kitchen and ended up in a library with a high ceiling, shelves running floor to roof, and a cast-iron ladder leaning against one of the walls. The air there was colder, with a sweet smell of old paper and leather, and the yellow light from 2 table lamps created quiet pools on the rug. There was a worn leather armchair by the window, and that's where I started stopping when I needed to breathe. I'd sit sideways, fold my legs, and pretend to read while I actually listened to the house. The distant click of a door, the murmur of the men at the entrance, the tick-tock of some clock I never managed to locate. Declan showed up Monday morning leaning against the car door, holding 2 cups of coffee. That would be the first of many identical mornings. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday would pass with the same silent choreography. Mrs. Doyle's coffee in the cup holder, North End traffic going by through the armored window, the clinic in the afternoon, the library at night. The steam rose in 2 parallel threads in the freezing air. He held one of them out to me without saying good morning. "The boss thinks a cold woman is an angry woman," he said, as serious as if he were reading a report. I agree. I took the cup, feeling the warmth pass through the thin glove and slide down my fingers like a small promise, and tried not to laugh. I failed. "You got any more folk wisdom to share, Declan?" "Plenty." He opened the car door for me, with that silent formality he never abandoned. But the boss pays by the hour, not by the philosophy. The smell of the coffee was strong, with a note of cinnamon that only one coffee shop knew how to make, and I recognized it before I brought the cup to my lips. It was Mrs. Doyle's. Someone had gone all the way there just for this. I glanced sideways at Declan, who was faking exaggerated concentration on the rearview mirror. The coffee shop was packed that morning. Mrs. Doyle, owner of that grimy little cubbyhole that always smelled of cinnamon and burnt coffee, met me with the same scowl as ever, as if nothing had happened. It was her way of telling me I still had a place in the world that didn't depend on anyone. Bree, behind the counter, raised both eyebrows the instant she saw me arrive in an armored car. "Cinderella of organized crime," she whispered, as I put on the apron, tightening the knot at my back with a sisterly tug. "Tell me everything. There's nothing to tell." "Celine, he sent you over in a president's motorcade." She shoved a towel into my hands and lowered her voice another notch. "I'm your best friend. I deserve a syllable. 1 syllable. And I swear on my earrings I'll give it back tomorrow. He's got too many hallways." Bree thought for a second, pretended to weigh the information like a juror in a courtroom, shrugged, and declared, "Accepted. For today." She looked me up and down, stopped at the wrist where the sleeve had ridden up a finger too far, and her smile lost a fraction of its shine that no one but me would have seen. She didn't comment. She just pushed me toward table 4, where a couple was waiting with the look of limited patience, and I was grateful for the routine, as if it were a blanket. In the afternoon, Declan took me to the clinic, not the decent clinic that was still to come, but the one my mother had been in since the year money turned into a rope stretched too thin, the smell of cheap disinfectant, lights flickering in the hallway, a receptionist who didn't look up for anyone less than a doctor, the green walls peeled near the baseboards, and there was an empty wheelchair sitting in the middle of the hall, as if someone had forgotten where they were going. My mother was in the corner bed, thinner than at the last visit, but her eyes lucid, the kind of lucidity that hurts more than forgetting. "Daughter," she said, and her hand, thin, the skin too fine over the bones, gripped mine with a strength her body didn't match. "You look different. It's just the hair. It's not the hair." She waited, calculating whether she could or couldn't, and her eyes moved across my face like someone checking an old photograph. "It's the way you sit. You're not afraid right now." I swallowed hard. I hadn't learned how to take her observations without falling apart, and the weak light of the room wasn't helping me hide anything. "Mom, I'm fine." "I know you are." She squeezed my hand again, and I felt her wedding ring, thin, loose on her finger, turn against my palm. "Celine, I'm sorry." "For what?" "For not being able to protect you from that man." Her voice trembled, but her gaze didn't. "I saw it. I saw the marks. I should have gotten out of this bed and broken his face with a chair, and I didn't get up. I'm sorry." I kissed the back of her hand because I couldn't say anything for a whole minute. My lips found paper skin, blue veins, the faint scent of the talc she still used. When I left the clinic, I walked to the car with my chin up only because Declan was watching me, and because crying in the parking lot of that clinic was a luxury I wouldn't allow myself. I sat down. That's when I saw the coat folded next to me. A heavy coat, darky, too new to have belonged to anyone before me. The inner label was still sewn in, and the smell was of a store, not of a closet. "Hey, Declan, what's this?" He adjusted the rearview mirror with the precision of someone who didn't want to answer. "A coat. I can see it's a coat." "Then you don't need me to confirm." I put the coat on before pride could talk me out of it. The lining was soft, pleasantly heavy on my shoulders, and it closed around my body as if someone had calculated my measurements without ever taking them. The car was warm, but the sleeve brushed my wrist, and I remembered I had left the house in short sleeves that morning, pretending the cold was a choice. Someone had noticed. The same someone who decided everything without asking. I closed my eyes and rested my head against the glass, feeling the vibration of the engine travel up my temple, and I promised myself that conversation wouldn't last past that night. The fight happened in the library. That same night, Ronan was sitting at the big oak table, with 3 folders open and a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. The ice already half melted, forming a translucent puddle at the bottom of the crystal. The fireplace in the corner was burning low, and the room smelled of sweet smoke, paper, and leather. I came in with the coat folded over my arm and set it down on the table, on top of the folders, like a letter of resignation. "Thank you," I said, but I didn't ask. He raised his eyes slowly. His gaze traveled the coat, my face, and went back to the coat. "You were cold. I know I was cold. I'm the person who was feeling it." I crossed my arms, because I needed to put something between the two of us. "Care isn't control, Ronan. You decide everything. You change locks on an apartment that isn't yours. You fire a nurse without consulting me. You leave a coat on the car seat, like it's magic. The nurse was mistreating your mother. I know she was mistreating her." My voice failed in the middle of the sentence, and I hated that. Hated that my body betrayed me before my mouth. "The question isn't whether you're right. The question is that you didn't ask me." He stood up. He didn't come closer. He just stayed standing, his hands resting on the back of the chair, his knuckles whitening for a fraction of a second before they relaxed. He was weighing his next sentence the way someone weighs a knife. "In my world, hesitating gets you killed. Celine. In mine, deciding for me kills differently." The silence lasted as long as it took me to count my own breaths. 4, 5. The wood snapped in the fireplace, loud, as if the house were listening too. Ronan walked slowly around the table, and each step of his on the rug sounded like a decision. He stopped half a meter from me. I could smell his cologne, something woodsy and expensive, with a shadow of tobacco that wasn't from his cigarette, but from the room where he had spent the afternoon, and the heat of his body crossing the space between us as if it were another kind of touch. "Teach me, then." His voice dropped an octave, and I felt that drop in my stomach. That way a smart woman recognizes and pretends not to recognize how to ask. Start with the verb. I didn't step back, even with my heart beating in a rhythm I hadn't authorized. "May I?" "That's a good verb." His hand came up. It didn't reach my face. It stopped in the air, centimeters away, fingers open like someone showing the palm before a boundary. I saw the fine scars on the knuckles, white against skin browned from old sun, and the matte gold ring, with that Celtic knot Declan had mentioned in passing in the car, glinting on his middle finger. I looked at that hand and realized, with a clarity that frightened me, that I wanted it to keep going. I wanted him to touch me, and I wanted, at the same time, for him to ask before he touched me. And those two things together were exactly what he didn't know how to offer. He stepped back first. He lowered his hand as if it weighed more than it should. He took a step back as if he had just remembered a rule he himself had written, and his shadow crossed my face in the firelight. "Good night, Celine." "Good night." I went up to the small room without looking back. The stair creaked on the 3rd step, as always, and the sound stayed with me until the 2nd floor. I lay down still dressed. I stared at the ceiling, where a thin crack cut across the plaster from one corner to the other, and counted the hours by the shadow the tree outside drew on the curtain. The sheets smelled of lavender. Someone had changed the bedding while I was out, and that small anonymous kindness bothered me more than it should have, until the phone vibrated on the nightstand. It was Bree. It was almost 11 at night, and Bree didn't call at that hour, unless she'd had too much to drink, or her cat had run off again. "Hello." Her voice came in broken. No joke. No nickname. "Celine." I heard someone speaking in the background. A police radio spitting codes. Heavy steps on a wooden floor. The noise of a door being held open. "The police are here at the coffee shop, looking for you." Chapter 4. The Accusation. 7 days later, on the following Thursday morning, I arrived at the coffee shop with Declan walking 2 steps behind me and the thick coat weighing on me like an ill-fitting armor. The whole week had passed in a blur of shifts, clinic visits, and short nights in the library, and the morning air still held the damp smell of snow melting on the sidewalk, mixed with the aroma of roasted coffee escaping through the half-open door whenever someone went in or out. Mrs. Doyle stood behind the counter, with her hands planted on the marble, staring at 2 officers as if she could knock them down with her gaze. Bree was on the other side, with her face red from held-in rage, holding a twisted dish towel between her fingers. 3 customers at the end of the room pretended to read the menu while holding their phones half-hidden at chest level. Celine Ward, the older officer, took a step toward me. He had a graying mustache and the tiredness of someone doing this too early in the morning. "I have a warrant." "For what?" My voice came out firmer than I felt inside. "Theft complaint. Irregular activity in the register. Missing deposit." Bree tried to speak, and Mrs. Doyle silenced her with a short gesture, 2 fingers in the air, the kind of command she used with late suppliers and rebellious grandchildren. "I didn't steal anything," I said, feeling my heart drop 2 floors inside my chest. "You can clear it up at the station, ma'am." When he pulled out the handcuffs, I heard the metallic click before I felt the cold of the metal on my wrist. The sound echoed through the coffee shop in a disproportionate way, as if every cup on the shelves had stopped breathing. Bree let out a sound that wasn't crying. It was worse. It was the pent-up fury of a woman who had seen too much. A customer raised his phone with no disguise at all, and I looked straight into the lens because I had learned, years ago, that lowering my face was inviting humiliation back for dinner. Declan walked up to the younger officer and said something in a low voice that ended with the word lawyer, pronounced like a polite threat. Then he turned to me. His eyes, usually loaded with dry humor, were so serious they seemed like different eyes. "You don't say a thing in there. Not even your full name." "Wait." I nodded. I crossed the dining room of my coffee shop in handcuffs, walked past Mrs. Doyle, who looked at me the way my mother could no longer look at me, and stepped out the front door under the gray sky of a Thursday I wanted to burn down. The bell on the door jingled behind me as if nothing there had changed, and that was the cruelest detail. The world kept on normal while I was being dragged through the middle of it. The station smelled of reheated coffee and old paper. The fluorescent lights flickered at slightly different rhythms from one another, and the ceiling, stained by water damage, betrayed decades of neglect. They sat me in a plastic chair, against a wall where there was a faded poster asking citizens to report abuse. I almost laughed. On the chief's desk, the formal complaint could be read. A signature in one corner, in a name I didn't recognize, and a reference to a report filed by Gavin Rowe as a witness. Pretty, cruel, efficient, everything he had always been. They barely asked me anything before a man in a gray suit I didn't know appeared, a leather folder under his arm and rimless glasses, speaking in a calm tone about bail, about procedural defects, about violation of image rights. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. Each sentence of his came down on the chief's desk, with the dry weight of someone who had already won that game before. In 20 minutes, I was back in the back seat of Declan's car, uncuffed, with my wrist red where the metal had pinched. Ronan wasn't at the station. Ronan hadn't come in to pick me up, or to show himself, or to talk to any reporter's camera. He had sent the gray suit, had paid the bail, had taken my name off any photographic record there, and had stayed home. I didn't know whether I was grateful or furious, and I arrived at the mansion with both of those things fighting in my throat. The car slid through the iron gate, and I stared at my own reflection in the foggy window, not quite recognizing the woman with the marked wrist looking back. He was waiting for me in the library, standing, empty hands. No whiskey, no folder, no rehearsed excuse. The afternoon light came in slanted through the heavy curtains, striping the dark rug in gold lines that stopped exactly where his shoes began. "Celine, you didn't come." "No." "Why?" "Because if I'd walked into that station, tomorrow your handcuffed photo would have been on the front page next to mine. You would never get a job anywhere in this city again without my last name stuck to yours." He spoke slowly, choosing every word as if I might explode between one and the next. "I sent someone who could pull you out without staining you. You decided again." "I decided." I threw the coat down on the table. The fabric fell heavy on the dark wood, knocking a pen that rolled to the edge and stopped there, balanced on the brink. "You're turning me into a saved woman. One of those who shows up in the columns with her hair in place and a rehearsed line about how wonderful her husband is. I'm not that. I never was that. It isn't salvation, it's strategy. Strategy is also a prison, Ronan." I took 2 steps toward him and stopped, because rage needs space to breathe. Between us, on the floor, there were exactly 3 meters of Persian rug and an entire lifetime of old habits. "You think caring is protecting an image? I think caring is asking me whether I want to walk into that station with my head up or leave through the back door. You didn't even consider asking." He walked slowly to the library door, stopped with his back to me, and rested his forehead against the dark wood on the inside. It was the first time I had seen that man look tired. His shoulders, before aligned like a ruler, dropped 2 millimeters. It was a lot. The white shirt tightened across his back, marking a line of muscles that wasn't there to intimidate anyone in that second, only to carry the weight of what he couldn't say. "Teach me, then." His voice came hoarse, without its usual elegance. "I don't know how to do it any other way." He turned around. He didn't look at me with a boss's coldness, nor with a protector's vigilance. He looked at me like someone confessing an old illiteracy, the kind that shames more than an open wound. I took a deep breath. The library air smelled of leather, paper, and a dark wood I had not yet learned to name. "Give me access." "How? To your contacts? To your lawyers? To your files on Gavin? I want to investigate this accusation on my own, not with your name in front, with mine. You lend me the tools. I use my own hands." He looked at me for what felt like a long time. The clock somewhere on the wall ticked 3 times before he nodded. A single nod, dry, definitive. "There's a clean laptop in the bottom drawer, on the left. The password will be on your phone in 2 minutes. He walked to the desk and picked up a dark leather folder I hadn't even noticed there. His long fingers ran along the side stitching before he handed it to me. "And these are the contacts. The middle one is the lawyer who got you out today. The top one is the auditor. The bottom one works in signature comparison. None of them are going to ask why you're requesting what you're requesting. Thank you. Celine." "Yes, if you need anything I can do, ask me. I promise I won't decide first." It was the hardest sentence he had spoken since I'd known him. I could tell, because he swallowed twice before reaching the end, and the apple of his throat went up and down with an almost audible sound. "Deal." Mrs. Doyle invaded the Vale mansion at the end of that afternoon. Bree had scribbled the address on a coffee shop napkin and stuffed it in her pocket as soon as the news of the arrest had spread, and she'd taken the first cab that pulled up to the corner. I heard the commotion in the hall before I saw it, raised voices filtering through the hallway, and when I ran downstairs, she was standing on the Persian rug with a leather purse the size of a small child, pointing her finger at Declan like she was pointing at a misbehaving grandson. "You don't stop me, young man. I came to see this so-called boyfriend of hers with my own eyes and tell him that if she walks through that door in handcuffs one more time, I'm showing up here again, and he is not going to like it. Mrs. Doyle, Mrs. Doyle, to you." She spotted me on the stairs. "Selena, come here." I came down unable to hide my smile. She hugged me with the improbable strength of a small woman, and her scent, brown sugar mixed with a cheap violet perfume, pulled me out of Boston for 2 whole seconds. There, in the entrance of a mansion that still felt strange to me, I cried for the first time that day. "You didn't steal anything," she said in my ear. "I know you didn't steal. Whoever grew up smelling cake in my kitchen in the morning doesn't steal anything from anyone. I know. And that big fellow," she whispered, without whispering, peering down the hallway over my shoulder. "Is he handsome?" "Mrs. Doyle." "I'm 62 years old, Celine. I ask what I want." Bree showed up when night was already falling, with the tablet under her arm and her coat still smelling of the cold from the street. The headlines circulating since that afternoon carried handcuffed photos of me, captured on a customer's phone, next to a profile about the mistress of Boss Vale and the alleged register skimming. Gavin had leaked the report before the bail was paid. He'd smiled for some reporter's camera asking for transparency and justice, with his tie crooked on purpose to look like an honest citizen caught by surprise. I'm going to find the wrong comma in him. Bree. Fine too. I'll hold the door. At night, I was already in the library with the laptop open, my wrist still red, 3 stacks of paper sorted by type of document, and a mug of coffee that Declan had left there without saying anything. The bronze lamp on the desk cast a tight yellow circle, leaving the rest of the library in bluish shadow, and the only other light came from the low embers of the fireplace on the other side of the room. Ronan appeared twice at the door. Both times, he didn't come in. The second time, he asked if I wanted him to stay. I said no. He respected it. The papers were dense. Coffee shop contracts, bank reports from Gavin's so-called partner, copies of old powers of attorney, financial transaction records from 3 shell companies that shared the same address in downtown Boston. I read slowly, comparing headers, checking dates, marking lines with a pencil and rereading. The tick-tock of the wall clock began to blend with the beating of my own heart. By 1 a.m, my eyes were burning. I kicked off my shoes and folded my legs under my body in the leather armchair, feeling the cold friction of the material under my stockings. At 2, I found the first odd detail, a deposit of $4,000 made on a date when the coffee shop had been closed for renovations. I remembered that week clearly. The smell of fresh paint stuck to Mrs. Doyle's hair, the counter covered in white tarps. Nobody deposited anything that day. Nobody could have. At 3 a.m, I stopped my hand over an old power of attorney, dated almost 2 years before. The signature at the bottom was Mrs. Doyle's, solid, rounded, with the D pulled downward. I knew that signature by heart, from so many receipts scribbled in front of the counter. I turned the next page. The paper scraped my thumb with a dry sound. Another power of attorney, more recent, authorizing Gavin's partner to handle accounts in the name of the coffee shop. Same shape, same curve, but the D didn't pull downward. It went upward. I picked up the cold mug of coffee, brought it to my lips without drinking, and looked at the partner's name printed there, in small letters, in the lower right corner of the forged power of attorney. I knew that name. Chapter 5, Parking Lot, 3 p.m. 3 days after the accusation, Mrs. Doyle's forged signature was right there, at the bottom of the power of attorney. With that flourish I knew better than my own handwriting. The real one ended with a closed loop on the YI, tight, almost angry, in the style of someone who had been signing meat orders for the butcher for 30 years. The one on the power of attorney had an open loop, hesitant, from someone who had never held a pen with that hand. And the partner's name printed beside it was a name I had seen exactly once in my life, on a payroll Gavin had forgotten in the kitchen of our old apartment, under a jar of mustard. Eli Sorensen, accountant, distant cousin, invisible man. It was almost 4 a.m. when I left the mansion's library. The shelves smelled of old leather and the cedar of the floor, and the only light on was the copper lamp over the desk, casting a honey-colored circle over the pages. I walked barefoot down the long hallway, listening to the silence breathe against the windows, feeling the Persian rug muffle every step. Ronan's bedroom door was ajar, a yellow sliver of warm light, but I didn't go in. For the first time in days, I knew what to do by myself. I slept 3 hours in the small room. I woke up with a dry mouth, a light head, and the smell of the clean sheets stuck in my hair. On Friday morning, I crossed the library again with the leather folder under my arm. Ronan was standing near the window, his white shirt open at the collar, the matte gold Celtic ring catching the faint Boston light coming in between the heavy curtains. He looked at me like someone waiting for an order, not like someone giving one. "I found it," I said, "but I'm not handing it over to you." He tilted his head a millimeter. That millimeter was the closest thing to a question he knew how to make. "I'm taking it to the prosecutor," I continued. "Harriet Quinn, you gave me her name on the list. I want the path of the law. I want Gavin to lose his mask in front of the whole world, not his life in front of an alley." Ronan took a while to answer. He walked to the desk, rested his hand on the back of the chair, as if he needed to steady himself, knuckles white from the pressure. Do you have any idea how long this is going to take?" "I do." I pressed the folder against my chest. "But it's my time, not yours." He stared at me for a long second. I saw the muscle of his jaw lock, release, lock again. I also saw the small, silent thing surrendering behind his eyes. He nodded once. That was all. And it was harder for him than any fight. Declan waited for me in the garage with the hot coffee, as always, and the thicker coat hanging from his arm, like never before. He didn't comment. Neither did I. We crossed Boston in silence to the gray prosecutor's building downtown, and the aroma of black coffee filled the car halfway. I went up alone. Harriet Quinn received me in a cramped office with light walls, paperwork stacked in 2 crooked towers, a dead plant in the corner that no one had the courage to throw out. It smelled of old paper and a woodsy perfume that probably came from her coat. She had short graying hair, quick eyes, a pen between her teeth. She looked me up and down with the calm of someone who had already seen women walk in there in worse shape. Celine Ward. She took the pen out of her mouth. I read your name in 3 reports last week, and none of them favored you. I hope you brought something that changes that. I set the folder on the desk. I opened it. Harriet flipped through slowly, her short nail running over the paper. She stopped at the compared signatures. She stopped at the partner's name. She stopped at the bank statement Eli Sorensen had moved 3 days after the false accusation. "Who got you the statement?" she asked, without looking up. An auditor. An honest one. Paid by whom? I looked at her without looking away. I came here because I chose the law over the other path. You know what the other path is. Harriet smiled from one corner of her mouth only. She picked up the phone, said 3 short sentences to someone in document forensics, asked that the statement be checked through official channels before the end of the day, and only then collected the folder with an almost ceremonial care, as if something fragile inside could crack. I knew that one day one of his women would walk through that door with real proof. You took a care few of them take. She rested her elbows on the desk. Fraud, stalking, forgery. I've had an investigation open against him for months, waiting for exactly this kind of documentary evidence. If forensics confirms the forgery by the end of the day, I'll request the warrant tomorrow morning. Out of respect for your work, I'll notify you before the arrest. I walked out of there with my legs finally steady. Declan opened the car door without a word and held out the coat. I put it on, and the smell of clean wool mixed with the shadow of Ronan's cologne wrapped around me completely. On Saturday, I went to the clinic. My mother was sitting up in bed, more lucid than I had been seeing her in recent months, with her hair combed by someone who knew how to be gentle. There was a new vase on the bedside with 2 small daisies, and the window was cracked open, letting in the damp smell of freshly cut grass from the inner garden. She held my hand and stayed looking at me as if she were reading a page she had memorized wrong her whole life. "Your chin is different," she whispered. "How so, Mom?" Lifted. She smiled faintly. I'd never seen it. I kissed her forehead, felt the light warmth of the thin skin, and promised I'd come back the next day. I didn't say the reason. On Sunday afternoon, 3 o'clock, I parked in the visitors' spot at the clinic. Declan had been tailing Gavin for 2 days at my request. I had authorized the discreet surveillance right after the meeting with Harriet, and he had been the one to confirm Gavin would show up there that afternoon. It was me who asked to close the net in the parking lot, with the police alerted by Harriet. Declan stayed in the car about 20 meters away, under my orders not to come out. Ronan was in a second car, farther back, under my orders not to appear until I called him. It had been the hardest thing I had asked for in the last few weeks, and he had accepted in silence, with that rigidness of jaw that said more than any voice. I crossed the parking lot with my keys clenched in my hand. The Boston sky was the color of washed steel, the wind coming in through the collar of my coat, lifting dry leaves that spun between the tires. I felt every step in the soles of my feet, the cold asphalt steadying my body from the ground up. It was between the 3rd and 4th car that Gavin appeared. He came out from the row of SUVs as if he had been waiting there all afternoon. He was in a navy suit, perfect as always, hair combed back, the smile of someone greeting clients in a waiting room. Only his eyes reminded me of who he was. Siren, voice low, sweet, deadly. "We need to talk." I stopped. My heart beat one time very hard, another time slowly, and then settled into a rhythm I didn't recognize. It wasn't panic, it was attention. "You don't have anything else to talk about with me, Gavin." He took a step. I didn't step back. He noticed, and the smile wavered for a second before coming back, thinner at the edges. "You forged Mrs. Doyle's signature," I said. "You used Eli. You faked the theft complaint in her name. You broke into my apartment and wrote on the mirror with my lipstick because you knew exactly where I kept my lipstick." I took a deep breath, the freezing air scraping my throat. "You always thought knowing my things was the same as owning them. It isn't. It never was." He laughed, but the laugh came out dry, never reaching his eyes. "Celine, you think a man like Vale is going to want you after the novelty wears off? I'm not talking about him. I'm talking about me. You're a waitress with a bruise. Another step. Without him, what are you?" I held his gaze. I felt the heavy coat on my shoulders, the cold air coming through my nose, the distant sound of a car door closing in the next space, the faint smell of oil and wet asphalt rising from the ground. I felt Ronan's presence 3 steps behind me, somewhere behind my shadow, not moving. "Without you," I said, slowly, "I'm a woman." Gavin moved forward again, and that's when I heard the dry step on the asphalt. It didn't come in front of me. It came to my side. Ronan stopped there, to my left, without touching me, his hand inside his jacket, and his eyes nailed to Gavin in a way that made the air chill more than the wind. Gavin stopped. "It isn't with you," Ronan said, low, without taking his eyes off him. "It's with her." I had never loved him as much as in that second. I turned back to Gavin. I was trembling, yes, but I went on. "Fear isn't love. Control isn't care. You don't have access to any part of me anymore. Not to my name, not to my job, not to my mother, not to my silence." I swallowed, tasting the metallic flavor of the cold. "It's over." The siren came before he could answer. 2 cars, without fanfare, stopping in a V behind him. Harriet had kept the exact word we had agreed on Friday. Execute the warrant when Declan signaled Gavin's approach. The officers surrounded him with the professional calm of people who had arrested worse men. Gavin looked at me one last time, and it was a look I'm going to remember for the rest of my life. Not because there was love in it, but because for the first time, it was a lost look. He no longer knew where to find me. They took him away. The sound of the handcuffs closing was the cleanest thing I had heard in years. I stood there for a time I couldn't measure. The wind kept coming through the collar of my coat, now carrying with it the smell of approaching rain. Ronan, beside me, finally took his hand out of his jacket. "I'll take you home," he said. "Home," I repeated, not yet understanding which one it was. I walked to the car on wobbly legs. Declan opened the back door and pretended not to see my face. I sat down, and the warm leather of the seat welcomed me like a discreet hug. Ronan came in from the other side. He didn't say anything. He just laid his open hand on the seat, between us, without turning the palm, without asking for a gesture. I looked at his hand. Broad, a thin scar near the thumb. I looked at the window, where Boston was beginning to roll past in gray and gold. I looked again at the hand. I touched mine sideways, just my fingers brushing his, and it was enough. We crossed Boston that way, in silence, fingers laced, and I didn't even notice when I started to cry. It wasn't a cry of fear, nor of relief. It was an old cry, from before Gavin, from before the clinic, from before the small room. The cry of a girl who had learned too early to swallow, and who now, in the back seat of an armored car, was finally spitting it all back out. Ronan didn't look at me. He knew I didn't want to be looked at while crying. He only squeezed my hand a little more firmly each time a sob passed through, and his thumb drew a slow circle on the back of mine, unhurried, without words. When the car stopped in front of the mansion, I had already stopped. I dried my face with the sleeve of the coat, his coat now, and took a deep breath. Declan opened the door. The light from the hall escaped through the tall window, golden against the dark blue of the late afternoon, spilling over the stone steps like honey. I went up the steps. I stopped at the landing. I looked at the hallway on the right, where the small guest room I had chosen weeks before was, with all my stubbornness. I looked at the hallway on the left, where his door was, darker, wider, quieter. Ronan stayed 1 step behind me, waiting, without asking, without deciding. I could feel the heat of his body rising up my back, even without touching. I didn't say anything, yet. I just closed my hand around the key to my room, the key I had demanded in the first week, as proof that the place was not a prison, and felt, for the first time, that that key was no longer deciding anything for me. Chapter 6. Unlocked Door. That Sunday night, still standing on the landing, I ended up going back to my small room, not because I had decided against him, but because I still needed to decide for myself. On Monday morning, Mrs. Doyle was waiting for me at the coffee shop counter with her apron tied crooked and her eyes red from someone who had rehearsed a speech all night so she wouldn't cry. The smell of cinnamon and freshly ground coffee rose from the counter as always, but there was something different in the air, a kind of respectful silence between the empty tables, as if the whole place knew something was about to change. "Sit down," she ordered, before even saying good morning. I sat on the tall dark wood stool, the same stool where I had tied on the apron so many mornings before sunrise. Bree came up behind the counter with 2 cups of coffee, and the most serious face I'd ever seen on a person who normally talks more than she thinks. She pushed a cup toward me without a word, which, coming from her, was practically a declaration of emotional war. "I'm no good at pretty things," Mrs. Doyle began, tapping her finger on the table. "So I'll be direct. You cleaned the name of this place. You almost got arrested for something that happened under my roof, and you could have turned your back. You didn't," she breathed. An air pulled in deep that seemed to hurt a little on the way. "I'm too old to run this alone. I want to offer you a partnership, a small one. Honest, 20%, to start." It took me 2 seconds to understand. The words came in order, but the meaning took a while to sit down inside me, as if I needed to make room where there had only been fear. When I understood, it was Bree who fell apart. "It's allergies," she sniffled, rubbing her nose with the dish towel she used to dry glasses. "Snow pollen." I laughed, quietly, and Bree didn't answer. She just stayed there, sniffling in silence, letting the laugh take the place of the joke. Mrs. Doyle extended her hand across the counter, over the cups, with the care of someone offering something fragile. I took it. Her hand was small and warm, and smelled like cinnamon, and I held on a little longer than I needed to because it was the first mother's hand I'd held without having to apologize. She squeezed back more firmly than that small body looked capable of, and I understood that there, between the smell of coffee and the low sound of the old fridge working, something in me had just signed an invisible paper. 20%, I repeated, just to hear the sentence spoken by my own mouth. 20%, she confirmed, serious as a judge. "And your name on the sign goes the same size as mine. When the old partner here decides to leave." Bree sniffled again. I pretended not to see. At noon, I went to the clinic. The nurses were carrying a light gurney, carefully, down the gray hallway I knew by heart. The walls of that place had an aged green tone that seemed to fade with each visit, and I always thought it was the color of institutional forgetting. My mother was going to be transferred to a decent clinic, on the other side of the city, with a big window, daily physical therapy, a nurse named Marta who had firm hands and a soft voice. Ronan had sorted the paperwork without showing up at reception. He had paid without telling me the amount. He had asked, this time, before deciding on the room. My mother was sitting in the wheelchair, with the plaid blanket on her lap, waiting. The blanket smelled of cheap soap and stopped time, and I recognized the worn pattern she had wrapped around my lap, when I was still too small to reach the floor sitting on the couch. "Daughter," she called, when she saw me. I knelt in front of her and rested my forehead on her thin knees. I felt the bone under the thin fabric of the pajamas, more visible than the last time, and I forced myself not to cry there, in that hallway, in front of those nurses who had seen too much to be moved by one more tired daughter. "Mom." She ran her hand through my hair, slowly, the way she did when I was 7 and crying over something silly. Her hand trembled a little, but the gesture didn't. The gesture stayed the same. "Then, are you all right now?" "I'm getting there, Mom." I lifted my face. "I'm doing well." She squeezed my hand. She kept looking at me in silence the whole time it took the nurses to set up the gurney. Her eyes traveled my face like someone checking a newborn child. She counted the features, compared them to memory, and seemed satisfied with the count. Before they left, she tugged my sleeve. "That fellow." Tiny voice. "You talk about him carefully." A man who makes a woman speak carefully is a man who's afraid of losing. I didn't answer. I just kissed her hand and promised I'd visit her at the new clinic the next day. The sentence stayed hanging in the hallway after the gurney passed, and I carried that sentence as if it were a pocket key, the kind we squeeze inside our coat when the wind picks up. I went back to the mansion in the late afternoon. The light was already that low winter light, golden inside, blue outside. The car slid down the snow-covered driveway, the tires making that muffled sound compacted snow makes, and the house appeared at the end the way everything we start calling mine appears without having the courage to say it out loud. Ronan was in the library. No jacket, white sleeve rolled up to the elbow, a glass of water on the desk instead of anything else. The fire lit in the corner fireplace let out a dry crack every few seconds, and the smell of burning wood mixed with the smell of old paper from the tall shelves. I sat in the armchair across from him. He didn't speak first. He waited. His patience was an almost physical thing. It took up space in the room. "Mrs. Doyle offered me a partnership," I said. "You deserve it, My mother was transferred. I know. Gavin is going to stay in prison. I know. I looked at him for a long time. The fire glowed in the water glass, 2 small points of orange inside the glass, and I noticed for the first time that he had a fine cut at his temple, almost invisible, the kind men like him collect without complaining. Or, why aren't you saying anything? Ronan rested his elbows on his knees, clasped his hands, looked at the floor before looking at me. His hands were large and well cared for, with light scars on the knuckles, and they stayed locked into each other as if he needed to keep something contained. Because I don't want you to confuse gratitude with choice. He raised his eyes. You're free to leave whenever you want, Selene. I paid the bail. I didn't buy you. I took a deep breath. The library air smelled of firewood, of the leather of the armchairs, and of a discreet cologne I had already learned to recognize in the dark. The words were there, ready, for days, waiting for me to have the courage to say them out loud. For the first time in my life, I want to stay. Ronan stood still. I saw his jaw relax a millimeter. I saw his shoulders drop 2 centimeters. I saw everything he couldn't say cross the short line between his eyebrows. He stood up slowly, as if he feared startling the sentence still suspended in the air between us. He walked over to the armchair. The dark wood floor creaked twice, just 2 steps, and even so that creak seemed louder than anything he had ever said. He leaned down. He kissed my forehead, as if it were the first prayer he remembered by heart. I held his face with both hands. I felt the short beard scrape the base of my thumbs, the warmth of his skin contrasting with the cold of my own hands. I pulled him down. The kiss was a single one, long, decided, unhurried, with the taste of everything I hadn't been able to ask for in recent months, and that he hadn't been able to offer without hurting me. I didn't tremble. I didn't apologize. I didn't close my eyes to escape. I closed them to keep. I kept the smell, the temperature, the weight of his hand resting on the nape of my neck like someone holding something that could break, but trust that it won't. When I pulled away, I took his hand. His fingers wound through mine with a calm firmness, unhurried. We crossed the library, the hallway, the landing. The lights in the house were low, that golden lighting he preferred at night, and the thick rug swallowed the sound of our steps. He stopped in front of his bedroom door and looked at me one more time, asking without asking. I turned the knob. The door closed behind us. The next morning came with a faint Boston light coming in through the tall window. The snow was still falling on the other side of the glass, in slow, generous flakes, and the whole room had that soft blue of the first hours, before the day decides what it's going to be. The light sheet was crumpled on one side only. Ronan was still sleeping, face down, his dark hair fallen over his temple, his arm thrown across the space where I had been. I stayed looking for an instant, just an instant, without any urgency to move. His shoulders rose and fell in a slow rhythm, and it was strange to see a man like him so disarmed, so given over to his own sleep. I went downstairs barefoot to the kitchen, dressed in his white shirt. The fabric smelled like him, and dragged on the floor behind me like a silly cape. The cold wood of the hallway bit the soles of my feet, and I liked the small discomfort, as if every detail of that morning needed to be felt clearly in order to become memory. I put water on the stove, the low tick of the blue burner lighting, the snap of the flame catching under the kettle, the soft murmur of the water beginning to warm. I took 2 cups out of the cabinet. 2 cups. The word seemed more like a miracle than the rest. He appeared shortly after, Tour in dark pajama pants, his hair mussed on the side he had slept on, also barefoot. He stopped behind me. He pressed his forehead against the nape of my neck for a short second. Then beside mine, I felt his breath move down my shoulder, warm, slow, and my whole body recognized that as the most intimate gesture of the entire night. He didn't say anything. He grabbed the coffee canister and measured out 2 scoops without asking how much. And it was at that instant, I had sworn it would be a happy instant and nothing more, that the question crossed my mind like the shadow of a bird on a white ceiling. How had he seen the bruise on my wrist so fast? That night, in the low light of the corner table, I smiled without answering myself. He held out the cup, with the handle turned toward my side, in the way no one had ever handed me a cup. It was a tiny detail, the kind of kindness you only notice when you receive it for the first time in your 20s, and you realize you'd spent your whole life accepting handles turned the wrong way without complaint. I smiled. I accepted. I rested my forehead against his and stayed there, with the hot coffee between us, and the snow continuing to fall outside over a city that had finally stopped seeming dangerous to me.